I want to welcome Bonnie North. She's the Green Party candidate for Barrie Innisfil riding in June 2nd election. Welcome, Bonnie, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, I want to get started with your personal on your Green Party website profile. You talk about your father's military posting took you to Europe and North America. So I just wanted to kick off by if you can talk about how that kind of inspired or inspired you to get into the politics and run for this election.
Well, it's interesting. When I was a kid, one of the postings my father had was in Washington, D.C., and that was right toward the tail end of the Vietnam War and also toward the tail end of the Nixon presidency. When I became politically active, at least involved, let's put it that way, because this is mind-blowing when I think about it, but the school that I went to was so interested in the politics of the region that on our lunch breaks, the Watergate hearings were broadcast. And we used to watch the Watergate hearings during our lunch breaks. And of course, I, like my fellow students, even though I was barely a teenager, I opposed the Vietnam War. So fast forward many, many years, and I become a parent myself and realize that I want to ensure that my son will inherit a livable planet, and not just my son, but all of our children and their children's children, and for generations to come. So I found a home in the Green Party of Ontario with respect to my values and their policies.
Interesting. So how, and you were also in the Navy Reserve. So how do you reconcile, your father's being in military, you being Navy Reserves, and also the anti-war mentality and advocacy?
Well, I can't speak for all Greens. I can only speak for myself.
Yeah.
I believe that there are times when we have to defend the vulnerable. And if that means that war is unfortunately one of those ways that we do that, then I believe that we might have to go to that. But we should always reach for diplomatic solutions first. And I mean, look at the example in Ukraine right now. They tried to avoid this invasion, this aggressive invasion. And what choice do they have? They have to defend themselves. And so I reconcile it that way. My father was a product of the Second World War. He grew up, and saw what happened. He was part of the, like he was a child, but he was brought up by the greatest generation who believed that we have to pull together and be responsible for everyone. And so he joined the Korean War. He was a veteran of the Korean War, and joined the military and was a veteran of the Korean War. And war is not the end goal. It is unfortunately a reaction to a breakdown in diplomacy.
Yeah, no, that's right. So also part of your career, you have been Gore Climate Reality Leader. Mm-hmm. And so I could say you are one of the party candidates who actually work in issues related to climate change, who have the expertise. So how was your association with the with that part with Gore climate action, and how that changed your views about climate change and environment?
So it didn't change my views, but it did inform them. I became a climate reality leader during the 2015 federal campaign. Prior to that, I had run as a provincial candidate in 2014. But prior to 2014, aside from voting in every election I was, eligible to vote in from, voting age, I hadn't been involved directly with a political party. But I have been doing things in 2014 and then again in 2015 and beyond that are environmentally aligned. So for example, I'm a registered nutritional consulting practitioner, and the more I learned about nutrition, the more I realized that how our food systems operate, not only in the larger regional ways and globally, but also how they operate locally, matter a great deal and have some significant environmental impacts. As a result of that, most recently, my husband and I became Whole Foods plant-based vegans for not only our own health and for compassion for living creatures, but because of planetary health. It's undeniable that what we eat and how we produce our food has a direct impact on the environment. And then with respect to Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project, that is a strictly volunteer initiative. So it's a training program. And then once we've received that training program and that sort of certification, then we on our own apply the knowledge that we gained to speak in the public in defense of our world and its planetary health.
Yeah, so just a couple of things from what you talked about. I wanted to first, so you mentioned you have been Green Party candidate 4 times since 2014. So just briefly, what were those campaigns and how that gave you the opportunity to interact with people and how that prepared you to run for MPP in Barrie, Innisfil?
Well, 2 of those campaigns in 2014 and 2018 were provincial. So I was prepared during those campaigns to run for MPP, as I am now. So this is my 5th election. At least, sorry, I should to correct. This is my 6th election. This is my 5th general election. I also ran in 2018 as a municipal candidate. And so you learn how to express ideas. It's not a perfect process, and you're definitely in trial by fire. You are definitely doing your best to express your values and your principles through the policies of the party that you represent. And so, like I said, 2 of those elections, and now this one, the 3rd, have been provincial elections, and then 2 of them have been federal elections, but for the Greens. So Global Greens have universal principles, and therefore it's easy for me to transition between provincial and federal with respect to our modus operandi, so to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now talking about the election issues, specifically in the last few months since the Ukraine war started, since the economic slowing down, the housing market is still affordability issues, but the market is cooling down compared to what it was 3 months back. So there are different issues in housing affordability as well as cost of living issues. Inflation is going through the roof.
Yeah.
So you are also a founding board member of Barrie's urban pantry. So I just wanted to understand what are your experiences in terms of people in Barrie dealing with cost of living and food crisis issues, and what is your personal and your party's platform to deal with that?
Okay, so the urban pantry is involved in sort of 3 main aspects with respect to food literacy. So we have a whole educational component to introducing people to certain foods. How do you cook with those? And then food security. So we offer a food basket program that is subsidized, that people can the healthy food box program, and people can purchase the good food box, pardon me, forgive me. Yeah, the good food box through the urban pantry, and people can purchase a good food box on their own behalf at a substantially reduced and very fair rate, or, and this is once a month, or they can purchase it on behalf of others and pay things forward. And then, so food literacy, food security, and we are also involved in making sure that the city of Barrie has a large number of community urban gardens in the city. So we have been working on that since 2017, and we're continuing to move forward, and hopefully eventually transition to also opening up a community food center in the Barrie area. With respect to how our party wants to deal with these issues, obviously we are concerned about making sure that people have the money that they need to purchase food, to purchase the gas for their cars, to put a roof over their heads. So one of the things that Greens have always advocated for, and that we continue to advocate for, is a universal basic income. We believe that everyone has the right to affordable housing, and not just affordable housing, but housing that is safe, and housing that allows them to live in dignity. And the same thing with respect to their options on purchasing their own food and paying all of their bills. So a universal basic income certainly addresses some of those things. We also want to move immediately to double Ontario Works and double Ontario Disability Support Plan payments. The NDP, we were the first to announce that we were going to double ODSP and OW. The NDP has recently changed their platform policy on this, but unfortunately they haven't really been good at clarifying that they're not doubling ODSP or Ontario Works. What they're doing is they're doubling their initial increase. So they had initially said that they were going to increase it by 20%, and there was understandably an uproar over that, because that continues to keep people well below their poverty line. So they've doubled that initial increase from 20% to 40%, but they certainly have not doubled ODSP. And the Greens are committed to doubling ODSP, and moreover, the NDP plans to transition to that increase over time, whereas the Greens are saying, no, we're going to do this now. And my personal opinion on universal basic income, for example, just today, I was signing a pledge to support universal basic income, because I have believed in this forever. As I mentioned, I've quoted before, Nina Turner says that poverty is a policy choice. And I want to see the end of legislated poverty. And Rutger Bregman, who has a wonderful TED Talk that I urge everyone to see on basic income, he says that poverty is not a lack of character, it's a lack of cash. So let's get people the money they need to live in dignity and in health.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting quote, not a lack of character, but lack of cash. And I think given now many, mainstream parties, what you call, they have, all these, years, for example, progressive conservatives were talking about, because I think they were the ones, who kind of froze the rate hikes for Ontario Works. And now,
like eons ago, back when Mike Harris was the premier, and unfortunately those Dickensian policies have carried over, and it just, it never gets better. It keeps getting taken away, and then it never gets added back. I give the previous liberal government credit because they instituted a pilot for universal basic income in a few cities here in Ontario, I believe in Lindsay and Hamilton, and I'm not sure if there were other cities. And it was really making a difference in people's lives. They were able to do things like make the choices to use that money to go back to school, or to use that money to start a small business, or to use that money to help them to transition to full-time meaningful paid employment, right? And so what does Ford do in 2018? As soon as he becomes the premier, he scraps that and says things like, well, the best way, for people to get out of poverty is to get a job. Really? Is that the best way? What if you can't work? What if you cannot work? Then what do? You remain in poverty for the rest of your life, and it is cruel and it is disgusting. And we need to stop these practices now.
Yeah, and one of the things, during the last debate, Green Party leader Mike Strainer, he targeted Doug Ford for dismantling, all the climate initiatives, even those were enacted by not only by liberal government but even by his own party. And in your campaign pledge, there's a separate section on new climate economy.
Right.
And in the beginning, you talked a little bit about Ukraine war, and then what happened because of the war. Now everybody has forgotten about the climate change. You see the coal and the oil are in demand, and people are ready to do whatever it takes. And they are kind of forgetting the pledges that the governments made at the Paris climate agreement. So would you want to talk a little bit about the new climate economy that Greens are proposing?
Right. So I'll just list some of the things, so
Yeah.
the broad strokes categories. And I would urge everyone to go to my website, bonnienorth.ca, and click on the Green Plan, or go to gpo.ca and click on the Green Plan. And that's our fully costed platform. So if you want to know the details of these things, they're all there. We certainly don't have the scope right now to go into them all, but I'll just list some of the things that we want to address. First, we want to establish an annual carbon budget to reach net zero by 2045, and that's real net zero. We want to electrify transportation, buildings, and industry to crush pollution and lower energy costs, provide up to $15,000 in incentives for homeowners for energy retrofits to help people save money by saving energy. And again, there's no, as far as I'm concerned, there is no argument that the Greens are the environmental choice in Ontario. We have always been known to be the environmental advocates, and that will not change. And so, as I said, our platform is completely, it's completely costed. So if you're curious about, well, what's it going to cost and how's it going to get paid for, you can have a look at that. And then on top of that, we talked about our food shed and we talked about our food system. So we also have to protect nature. We need to protect our wetlands. So we want to institute a blue belt plan that will protect our watersheds, and we will grow the green belt, but also start a blue belt. One thing I do want to say though, and this is absolutely crucial, that farmers work the land, and farmers know the land and they love the land. They also go a long way to providing those sorts of environmentally beneficial practices to store carbon in the soil, to plant trees and so on and so forth, to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And so we want to make sure that when we are looking at blue belt plans and green belt plans, and now this is my personal opinion, okay, is that we should be looking at what this land is in value to the farmers. And so there are models for preserving farmland in the state of Pennsylvania and in the state of New York that the the public, through our taxes, through our government policies, pays market value to farmers for their land, so that then that land permanently becomes a part of the public good through green belting and through blue belting. I personally do not believe in expropriating someone's land for that purpose, however important it is, because farmers have invested in this land and they deserve to get they deserve consideration for that investment. And they haven't just invested money, they have invested their time and often their lives in this land. So let's honor that by demonstrating that the public good is being served by paying for this land rather than, and I'm not saying that our green belt plan or our blue belt plan includes expropriation. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that this is an important nuance to put forward.
And there is another issue, when it comes to climate change and the protection of Simcoe Lake is the proposed two highways, right? Highway 413 and
yes.
Bradford.
Bless you. The Bradford bypass.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, it's interesting you should ask me about that, because just today I was responding to a reporter who's writing a story about the Bradford bypass. And so we, like, personally, and myself and we Greens, we oppose these highway extensions. So let's talk about something that people don't talk about. It's not that we don't care about gridlock, because we do. We want to make sure that people can get to and from their jobs, to and from their errands, and all of the things that they need to do quickly, efficiently, and safely. We absolutely support that. But what we recognize, and what people don't talk about when they talk about reactively building these kind of roadways, is that there is the law of induced demand. And that means essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you build it, they will come and they will come and they will just keep coming. So sure, building a highway is like putting a Band-Aid on a huge cut, right? It might stop a little bit of the bleeding for a little while, but eventually you've still got to deal with the original problem. And the original problem isn't that we don't have enough highways, at least in this part of Ontario, in the southern part of Ontario. In the north, it's a different issue. We have to certainly increase and improve highways up in the north. But in this part of Ontario, the biggest problem is that we have underfunded and underinvested in decent, reliable, affordable transit. It is a travesty that in a developed country like Canada and in a wealthy, developed province like Ontario, you're lucky if you can find proper intracity transportation, let alone in your own city. And I'm a transit user. I choose, well, before the pandemic, I chose to use transit primarily. But transit is inconvenient, it's expensive, and it's inefficient. And now it's difficult to get from one city to the next city. And it has been for a long time, and the pandemic only made that worse. So let's fix the problem at its source. Let's deal with the transportation problem rather than adding more problems by adding to pollution and increasing the emissions of greenhouse gases and contributing to the climate emergency and destroying farmland and destroying biodiversity and destroying our wetlands. Let's stop doing that, and let's do the things that we need to do and we should have been doing all along to get to where we need to go. And building highways, like I said, scratching an itch, but eventually the itch is going to come back. We're going to have more gridlock, and then what are we going to do? It's completely unsustainable.
Yeah, no, that's right. And another issue that came to light during the pandemic was, of course, the healthcare. The healthcare not for the ordinary citizens, but also for the especially for the senior one. We have also seen a big backlog of surgeries as hospitals were dealing with the COVID patients. As a result, there are thousands of people who waited for the surgery. Many of them died. And
Yeah.
what do you think is the solution to the healthcare crisis and also to the senior care home crisis?
Okay, well, the solutions are extremely complicated and urgent. But before we talk about solutions, let's talk about how we got here.
Mm-hmm.
We got here, again, because of years and years and years of cuts to the system. In my experience, anyway, I was a Red Cross, used to be called back then homemaker, PSW, but we called them homemakers back in the day, when Mike Harris was the premier, and that's when cuts started happening to home care, and then those cuts became translated to broader healthcare and certainly in long-term care. So I saw that happening when it started happening, and it was discouraging. And unfortunately, a succession of governments has failed to improve the problem. And then on top of it all, we are continuing to move and move closer and closer to corporate care. So a lot of the facilities, in fact, well, I won't say all of them, but certainly a lot of the facilities where the worst treatment and problems with respect to seniors during the beginning waves of the pandemic happened in for-profit care. And you know that you are failing, you are utterly failing when you have to call the military in to feed people, to clean them. The military went in, and in the report, they reported things like feces on the floor and the walls. They reported seniors laying alone with feces caked underneath their fingernails. 26 people in one home died, not from COVID, they died from dehydration. That means they starved to death. That is unconscionable. We are not some kind of war-torn, corrupt country. And why did this happen? Because our governments keep moving toward favoring corporations. And so Greens are saying, let's put compassion ahead of corporations. Let's put seniors ahead of shareholders. So in order to go through the list of what to do, I don't know how much time you have. Again, I would encourage everyone to go to our platform and look and see what we have to say about long-term care. But just for starters, okay? We're going to build more nonprofit long-term care beds. We expect to put in 55,000 by 2033 and at least 96,000 by 2041. And create more Indigenous-led long-term care homes and allocate a portion of these new beds to them. Create an accountable, non-profit long-term care system and increase long-term care funding by 10% and phase out for-profit homes and stop licensing new ones. We want to repeal Bill 218, which shields long-term care owners and operators from liability, which is another chummy thing. Oh, and by the way, Mike Harris is a corporate board member of long-term care homes in Ontario. Just saying. Anyway, so we want to repeal Bill 218, and we want to reinstate annual comprehensive inspections of homes without advance notice, and ensure homes with infractions face legislative consequences. And we want to increase the number of nurse practitioners proportionate to the number of residents and so on. And we want to also make sure that personal support workers are getting paid an income that is commensurate with their hospital counterparts. And like I said, I could literally go on for hours reading the different things that we intend to do. And obviously we don't have enough time for that. So again, I encourage you please to go to the platform and look at that yourself.
Yeah, and one last thing I want to talk about is the Indigenous issues, whether it's healthcare or the impact of of the climate change, or even the critical infrastructure laws that has been passed, that are stopping Indigenous people from protesting the encroachment of big corporations on their yes. land. So
yes.
So in terms of your advocacy, or what Green Party's plan to address clean water, healthcare issues when it comes to Indigenous people.
Right. So this is such a difficult, all of these issues are difficult to deal with because they deal with such tragedy, and tragedy that is born out of greed and bad policy and completely unnecessary. So when it comes to Indigenous peoples who are protesting the encroachment on their land and the heavy-handed application of police and their behavior against those people, I want to just contrast that with the ridiculous truckers convoy in Ottawa. And they took over the city of Ottawa for weeks. And I'm not saying the cops should go in and bust heads. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I want to ask why, and I can certainly answer, I can speculate, but why are Indigenous people who are protesting the injustice of colonialization and all of the things that have stemmed from that on their land and how they are treated? And then we have a bunch of people who are protesting like freedom, you know, like, oh my God, how dare you say that maybe we should be vaccinated or wear a mask in public? Like, to contrast how the police reacted to that and how they've reacted to Indigenous peoples is disgusting. And in my opinion, it's completely the result of racism, and knowing and believing that Indigenous peoples, for whatever reason, don't have political sway with them to the degree that a bunch of people showing up in loud vehicles and taking over an entire Canadian city do. So let's be real. A lot of the problems that we have with respect to Indigenous peoples in Ontario and in Canada are the direct result of colonialism and racism. And that includes the policies with respect to their land expropriation. And on top of that, environmental racism, it's a thing. Like, let's talk about Grassy Narrows. Let's talk about how, from 1962 to 1970, 10 tons of untreated mercury were dumped into the English Wabigoon River, and that the Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous communities in that area are to this day dealing with this problem. And it's just recently that the government has finally gotten its act together to start instituting some additional health supports to deal with this problem. It's unclear whether or not they will ever be able to clean up the river. It's completely unclear. And again, the Ontario Greens and all Greens support implementing all of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and honoring UNDRIP as well. And with respect to specific things that we wish to do for, to help work with Indigenous communities and stakeholders, that again, and I hate to keep doing this, but it would take us hours to go through it all. That is also in our platform.
Yeah, so my last question is, many people say, we have progressive conservatives on the right, and then liberals, Greens, and NDP, many people put them in kind of similar bucket, and say Greens and NDP, in some cases, Greens, or depending on which province you live in, who has the better chance, but they are spoiling it for progressive conservatives. So in that sense, how do you? I know you talked about the Greens plan regarding various issues, but what is your a short pitch to people saying, asking them to vote for Green, and not just to say they are there to spoil the party, the elections.
Okay, so you're talking about spoiling the vote for the left,
yeah,
leaning progressive parties.
Yeah.
So I'll deal with that in a second. But first, what I'll say is, if you want to know how Greens can affect policy and government, you just need to look at someone like Mike Schreiner, who has been, for the past 4 years until the legislature was dissolved, has been punching above his weight. He managed to get 2 bills into final reading. 1 MPP did that. There are MPPs that spend their entire careers who have never done anything like that. And Greens do this by collaborating and cooperating, because let's be honest, we know that for the foreseeable future, we will not form government in this province unless a miracle happens. But we're realistic about that. So we are committed to working with people who are also committed to working with us to bring policy that is good and compassionate and caring to people. And so that's how we are effective. That's how we get things done. And to anyone who says that Greens are the spoiler, all I can say is, if you believe in democracy, then you've got to stop talking about strategic voting. This has to stop. And it's appalling that governments like the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives in various places across Canada and in Ontario have paid lip service to electoral reform. But what they do is they say it's a bait and switch. It's like, okay, yeah, we believe in electoral reform, so let's have a referendum about it. But referendums skew to the status quo unless you do two things. You have to educate the public thoroughly before the referendum is called. And then the referendum has to be worded in such a way that people can understand it and that the answers are not ambiguous. So the Liberal government did have a referendum. I believe it was back in 2007. Don't quote me, but I believe it was around then. And that was on the ballot along with in the general election. I, as a voter back in 2007, don't remember receiving any education about this. I don't remember any kind of public anything about it. And there it was. And I didn't know back then what that meant. So I don't even remember how I voted for that. In PEI, there was a referendum in 2016. And the premier of PEI, I believe he was conservative, the conservative premier of PEI, said that I'm going to abide, it's going to be binding, I'm going to abide by the results of this referendum. So what happened? They passed with a majority. The referendum passed to institute electoral reform with a 51% vote. And then he said, oh, well, that's not binding, right? That's not enough of a vote to be binding. Here's the irony on that. He was elected in a false majority government with 39% of the vote. So explain that, right? And then finally, in I believe it was 2017 or 2018 in British Columbia, the NDP government, NDP are always about electoral reform. The NDP government had a referendum on electoral reform. Did they educate the public? No. What was happening was Greens were going out and lobbying to educate the public, but it just wasn't enough. And what a surprise, the referendum didn't pass. And then in 2019, our local Barrie Innisfil candidate at the end of the 100th climate debate, if you believe in electoral reform, if you believe in democracy, you don't say things like this at the end of a debate. You don't say, oh, and by the way, the NDP are the strategic vote in this riding. No, you don't talk about strategic voting because strategic voting is the problem. We need to fix our electoral system. It's undemocratic. It was only designed for two parties, and we don't exist in a two-party reality.
No, yeah, thank you for that. So that's all I have. But do you have any final message to voters? Any appeal to them?
The best thing that I can say is that if you want real change, then voting for status quo is not going to get you the change that you need. And beyond that, though, I will say that no matter who you vote for, you need to get out and vote, because only when we vote can we really, truly do and get the things that we need. And finally, I would hope that you would consider voting for me, Bonnie North, your Green candidate in Barrie Innisfil. And again, please go to bonnienorth.ca and look and see how you can get involved.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So thank you again, Bonnie, for your time. And I really appreciate you talking to me today.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you inviting me.